The eastbound came into Tallow Springs late, by the better part of an hour on a raw March afternoon in 1887, and by the time it did, there were more people standing on that depot platform than had ever stood there for any funeral, any election, or any visiting preacher in the whole history of Harrow County, Kansas. They had not come for the mail. The mail sack was a thin thing that sprang, and everybody knew it. They had come because Ambrose Teal, who kept the store and owned the cane mill and set the price of nearly everything a man in that valley could buy or sell, had spent 11 days telling anybody who came through his door that there was a woman riding out from Tennessee to marry Gideon Renner, and that she was worth the walk to see. Ambrose Teal had a way of saying a thing so that the meanness in it sat just under the words, where a man could laugh at it and still tell himself he had not laughed at anything cruel. He would lean on the counter with his thin gray side whiskers and his narrow mouth, and he would say, "Well, Renner has sent away for a wife, and she has answered. And I will say no more than that a man ought to be careful what he writes down on paper." Then he would let his eyes travel around whichever men happened to be leaning on his barrels, and one of them would say what Teal would not say himself, and there would be that low laugh that runs around a room like water finding a crack. So they came. There were farm wagons drawn up along the whole length of the siding and horses tied 3 deep at the rail in front of the freight house. There were women in their second-best bonnets who would have told you they had business at the store, and men who did not bother to pretend they had business anywhere at all. The liveryman came. The blacksmith came with his sleeves still rolled. Josiah Pike brought his whole family in the spring wagon. Reuve Dennard, who farmed the biggest piece of corn ground on the Muddy Fork and weighed 240 pounds of it himself, stood on an empty nail keg at the north end of the platform so he could see over the crowd, and he had a way of rocking on that keg that made the men around him grin before anything had happened at all. The 17 were there, of course. They stood loosely together the way men do when they share a secret they are proud of near the baggage truck, and every one of them had a hand in what was coming, and every one of them believed that afternoon that it was going to be the funniest thing that had happened in Harrow County in years. They were the cane growers. That is what they called themselves, though not one of them had more than 1.5 acres of sorghum cane behind his corn, planted the way a man plants a thing his father planted, to make a little molasses for his own table and his own hogs, and to have something sweet in the house that did not have to be paid for in cash money. 17 men subscribed to Ambrose Teal's mill, hauled their cane down in October, waited their turn, and took home whatever Teal's boiling pan gave them back after Teal had taken his share off the top. They were not bad men, most of them. They were tired men in a hard country in a year that was already looking dry in March, and they had found something to laugh at. And they had held on to it the way you hold on to a warm cup. Because Gideon Renner had never written that letter. The letter had been written in Teal's back room in January by a committee of them, with a bottle going around and Reuve Dennard doing most of the talking, and it had been copied out fair in the schoolteacher's hand by a young fool who thought it was only sport. And it had gone east to a marriage paper in St. Louis with Gideon Renner's name signed at the bottom of it in a hand that was not his. They had described him honestly enough. They said he was a big man with a good spring and 40 acres broke and no debts, which was true, and they said he was a quiet man who kept to himself, which was truer than they knew. And then they had waited, and 3 answers had come, and they had gone through the 3 answers at the store counter on a Saturday afternoon like men picking a horse. 2 of the answers were from women who wrote a small, neat hand and said they were slender and of a cheerful disposition. Those 2 went into the stove. The 3rd answer said this. It said, "My name is Sabra Hoyt. I am 29 years old. My father is dead, and the place is sold." It said, "I can keep a house and a garden, and I can work outdoors as long as there is light, and I have never been sick a day." And then it said, in a plain square hand with no apology in it anywhere, "I am a very large woman, and I will not have you surprised. I weigh 336 pounds. I am telling you that first so you may say no to it now, and save us both the fare." Rufe Dennard read that part out loud twice. The second time he read it, he had to stop in the middle because he could not get his breath for laughing, and the men in the store laughed with him, and Ambrose Teal took the letter out of his hand and read it over silently, and then folded it and put it in his waistcoat pocket, and said, "Well now." He said it as gently as a man deciding to buy a horse he has no use for. They sent the fare. 17 men put in for it, and each one of them said afterward that it was Teal who had suggested it, and Teal said afterward that it was Dennard, and it did not matter, because all 17 of them put money on that counter, and all 17 of them knew what they were paying for. They were not paying for a wedding, they were paying for a morning at the depot. It was meant as a joke, and every man who put his money down understood exactly what the joke was, and none of them said the word out loud, because the word was her body. Nobody told Gideon Renner. That was the whole point of it. Gideon Renner came down off his place at the head of the valley perhaps twice a month, bought flour and coffee and nails, said as few words as a man can say and still be served, and went home. He had come out of the high country in Colorado 3 years before with a wagon, a good axe, 2 mules, and a way of standing that made loud men quieter without his ever raising his voice, and in 3 years no one in Tallow Springs had learned one single thing about him that he had not been obliged to say. He had built a stone and sod house into the south face of the ridge above the spring. He had broken 40 acres. He had never once been drunk, and he had never once come to a dance. So Teal had sent word up to him on the Wednesday. Just a line, carried by the mail rider, saying there was a matter at the depot Saturday that concerned him and he had best come down. And the whole town knew what Gideon Renner did not, and stood on that platform in the raw March wind, waiting to watch a big silent man be handed a woman he had never sent for. The train came in. There was a good deal of steam and the usual noise, and the mail sack went over, and then the car door opened and the conductor put the step down, and the crowd on that platform went as quiet as a church. She came down out of that car, slowly, because there was no other way she could have come down it, one hand on the iron rail and the other holding her skirt clear of the step, and the plank floor of the platform gave a little under her boots when she stood on it, and everybody heard it. She was a very large woman. There is no gentle way around that, and she would not have wanted one. She was broad through the shoulder and broader through the hip, thick through the arm and the wrist, with a full round face and a soft double chin and dark brown hair pinned up under a faded blue head cloth, and she wore a brown calico dress buttoned to the throat and a gray wool shawl and boots that had been resoled by somebody who knew how. She weighed 336 pounds, as she had written down for them in her own hand, and she stood there in the cold with her chin level and let them look. Then somebody laughed. It was one of the young ones near the freight house, and it came out of him high and surprised, the way a laugh does when a man has been holding it for 11 days. And once it was out of him, it went through that crowd from one end of the platform to the other like fire in dry grass. Rufe Dennard laughed so hard on his nail keg that he had to be steadied. 2 women laughed behind their gloves and were ashamed of it later, one of them for 30 years. Somebody in the back called out a word about the freight scale in the depot yard and asked whether they oughtn't to run her over it, and that brought a fresh roar. And somebody else answered him, and that was worse. Sabra Hoyt stood on the platform in the middle of all that noise and did not move. She had one carpet bag, one small flat trunk that a man could have carried under his arm, and under her left elbow, where she had held it the whole way from Tennessee, a long flat bundle wrapped in a flour sack and tied with twine. She set the carpet bag down. She looked along the faces the way a woman looks along a fence line, without hurry, and the laugh began to come apart at the edges, because a person laughing is expecting the other person to do something, and she did not do anything at all. Ambrose Teal came forward through the crowd, and the crowd let him through, and he took off his hat, which made it worse, because a man taking off his hat is claiming to be polite. He said, "Miss Hoyt, is it?" She said, "It is." He said, "I am afraid there has been a mistake." And there it was, out in the open in the cold. and the platform got quiet again to hear it. He said the letter had been written in fun. He said it in a careful, regretful voice with his hat still in his hand, and he said the word fun twice. And he said that Mr. Renner had not written it, did not know of it, and could not be held to it, and that the fare would be refunded and she could go back east on Tuesday and no harm done to anybody. And behind him, while he was saying all that, one of the 17 made a low remark to another one about what the fare had bought and how it had been money well spent, and the two of them made a noise, trying not to laugh, and she heard it. Everybody heard it. She said, "And who wrote it?" Teal said, "That hardly signifies now." She said, "It signifies to me. I have come 900 miles on it." And Teal, who was enjoying himself more than he would ever afterward admit to his wife, half turned toward the baggage truck and said, "Well, there were a number of us." She looked at the 17. She looked at them one at a time, and it took her a while, and the ones on the outside of the group found things to look at down the track. Then she said, "I see," and she picked her carpetbag back up. That was the moment Gideon Renner came onto the platform. He came up the steps at the west end, and men got out of his way without deciding to. He stood a head and shoulders above every other man there. 6 feet and 4 inches of him in a heavy fur-collared buckskin coat with a dark wool shirt under it, his black hair down to his shoulders, and a short dark beard on a face that was weathered brown, and though the women of Tallow Springs would not have said so out loud in that particular crowd, uncommonly good to look at. He had come down expecting a matter of business. He stopped just inside the crowd and read that platform the way he would have read weather, and it took him about 4 seconds. He looked at the 17. He looked at Ambrose Teal with his hat in his hand. He looked at the woman standing alone in the middle of all of them with her bag in her fist and her chin level and her face perfectly still. And he saw what everyone else on that platform had somehow managed not to see, which was that she had been standing there for a long time now in front of 200 laughing people and had not once looked at her own feet. Nobody there ever agreed afterward on exactly how long he stood without saying anything. Josiah Pike said it was a minute. Teal always insisted it was no more than a breath or two. What they did all agree on was that the platform got quieter and quieter the longer it went on, until the loudest thing at that depot was the engine ticking as it cooled. Then Gideon Renner walked across the boards, and the crowd opened for him, and he stopped in front of her and took his hat off. He said, "Ma'am." She looked up at him. She had a steady gray eye, and she used it. She said, "They tell me you did not write to me." He said, "No, ma'am, I did not." She said, "Then I will not trouble you. I would be obliged for the loan of the fare, and I will pay it back by the year's end, and I will trouble nobody in this county for anything else." And Gideon Renner said, in a voice that did not carry much past the two of them, and yet somehow got repeated in every kitchen in Harrow County by Sunday night, "No, ma'am, I did not write it, but I would not take back a word of it if I had." Then he bent down and picked up her flat trunk in one hand and her carpetbag in the other, and he said, "Is that everything?" She said, "That is everything but this." And she moved the long bundle and the flour sack around under her arm, and she did not offer it to him, and he did not ask for it. They walked down the length of that platform together past 200 people, and not one soul said a word, and Rufe Dennard got down off his nail keg. There's a thing that happens in a small country place when a joke fails. The people who told it do not go home and think it over and repent. They go home angry, and they look for a way to have it be somebody else's fault, and they find one. By Sunday, the story going around both saloons in Tallow Springs was not that 17 men had paid a woman's fare across half a continent in order to have a laugh at her body on a public platform. The story going around was that Gideon Renner had been made a fool of and had been too proud to admit it, and that the fat bride from Tennessee had got herself a place and a name and 40 broke acres out of a piece of paper she had no right to, and that she must have known all along, and that there was something not straight in a woman who would answer such a letter in the first place. It is easier to carry. They were married on the Tuesday, in the front room of the parsonage, with the preacher's wife and the preacher's hired girl standing up as witnesses because nobody else was asked. She wore the brown calico. He wore the same coat. The preacher, who was a decent enough man and frightened of his own congregation, asked her twice if she was doing this of her own free will, and she said yes both times, patiently, the way you answer a child. When it was over, Gideon Renner shook the preacher's hand and paid him $2 and went out and brought the wagon around. They drove up the Muddy Fork Road 9 miles to his place with her trunk and her carpetbag in the box behind them, and the long bundle across her knees, and they did not talk much. And what talk there was about water. He asked her whether she had ever seen a country as dry as this one looked in March. She said she had not. She said, in Tennessee the trouble is generally too much of it in the wrong month. He said, out here the trouble is generally that it does not come at all, and then it comes all at once, and then it does not come again. She looked out at that country for a long time as it went by, at the buffalo grass just barely greening, and the sky with nothing in it, and the far-off line of cottonwoods along the creek that told you where the water was, and she said, what does your ground do in a dry year? He said, it burns up. Everybody's does. And Sarah Renner, as she was then, said nothing at all for about a mile. And then she said, what will you take for the bottom land along that creek? He turned his head and looked at her. She said, 12 acres of it. The flat piece with the sand in it that you have not broke. I will pay for the breaking out of what it makes. He said, that is the poorest ground on the place. She said, I know it. That is why I want it. He drove another quarter of a mile. Then Gideon Renner said, ma'am, everything on that place is yours and has been since Saturday, and you do not have to buy any of it from me. But I would like to know what you mean to put on it. And she put her hand flat on the long bundle across her knees, the one she had carried 900 miles under her arm and would not give to anybody, and she said one word, Cain. The place at the head of the valley was better than she had let herself hope for, and poorer than the men who wrote that letter had made it sound, which is the way of most things a person is promised. The house was stone below and sod above, set back into the south face of the ridge so that the north wall was mostly hill. With a plank door and 2 real glass windows he had freighted up from the county seat, and a stovepipe through the roof, and a floor of pounded earth swept as clean as a table. There was a spring under a limestone ledge 40 steps from the door that ran cold and steady in a year when half the wells in Harrow County were being deepened. And that spring was the single best thing anybody in that valley owned, and Gideon Renner had known it when he filed on the homestead. There were 2 mules, a milk cow, a lean-to stable, a pole corral, a good axe, a whetstone, and a shelf of tools kept oiled. There were no chairs. There was 1 bench, 1 bed, 1 table he had made out of packing crates, and a coffee pot. He carried her trunk in and set it down, and stood there in the middle of that one room with his hat in his hand, looking as close to uncertain as that man ever looked in his life. He said, I have not had cause to fix it up. She looked around that room slowly, at the swept floor and the oiled tools and the clean pot, and something in her face let go by about 1/4 inch. She said, it is dry, and it is tight, and there is water at the door. I have kept house in worse, and so has everybody I am kin to. Then she said, I will take the bed, and you will take the lean-to, until such time as we are better acquainted, and I will thank you not to argue about it in front of the mules. And Gideon Renner, who had not laughed out loud in the hearing of another human being in 3 years, laughed. That was the first day. Here is what Harrow County did not know about the woman they had paid to come out and be laughed at, and what they would not know for 7 months, because not one of them asked her a single question about herself until October. Her father was Ephraim Hoyt, and Ephraim Hoyt was a syrup man. up on Copper Creek in the hills of Middle Tennessee, where the ground is too broke up for a big farm and every family lives off a little of everything, there is one week in the fall when the whole country smells like nothing else on this earth. And that is the week the cane is worked. Ephraim Hoyt had a 3-roller mill under a shed roof and a sweep pole 13 feet long and a stone furnace with a long flat copper pan set on it, and for 30 falls running, from the time he was a young man with black hair until the fall he died with his hands gone bad, people came down out of those hills hauling cane on sleds and in wagons and on their own backs. And Ephraim Hoyt turned it into syrup for a share, and no man in that end of the county ever went to anybody else. There is nothing hard about crushing cane. A boy can do it. There is nothing hard about boiling juice, either, in the sense that any fool can put a fire under a pan. What is hard is knowing when to pull. Sorghum juice comes out of the rollers thin and green and cloudy and tasting like grass and sweet water together. It goes in the pan at the cold end, and it works its way down the pan as it cooks, and it throws up a green scum first, and then a heavier scum, and then a fine tan foam, and all of that has to come off, every minute, all day, with a long-handled skimmer. Or the syrup will be bitter and dark, and nobody will buy it twice. And at the end, at the hot end, in the last few feet of that pan, there is a moment, and the moment is not long. Before it, you have thin syrup that will sour in the jug by Christmas. After it, and it is not 5 minutes after it, you have scorched sugar and a ruined batch and a pan to scrape. Ephraim Hoyt found that moment by lifting the skimmer up out of the pan and turning it sideways and watching how the syrup came off the edge of it, and he taught his daughter to do the same thing before she was 10 years old, standing on an upended nail keg to reach. Thin, and it runs off in a stream, and it is not ready. Ready, and it hangs on the lip and lets go in a broad sheet like an apron, and the last of the sheet breaks into a flake that curls. And there is a sound the bubbles make behind it, a heavier sound, and there is a smell that changes about a half a minute before the flake does, and if you know the smell you have that half minute to get the pan drawn off. She knew the smell. She had known it since she was 9 years old. She had stood at her father's pan every October of her life, and for the last 6 years of it, after his hands went bad with the swelling so that he could not hold the skimmer steady, she had not stood at his pan. She had run it. Copper Creek's syrup for 6 falls was hers, and everybody on Copper Creek knew that, and not one soul in Harrow County. Kansas had the first idea of it, because nobody had asked. When Ephraim Hoyt died, the place went for the doctor's bill and the note on the mill, and the mill went to a man in the next county who wanted the iron. Sabra Hoyt was left with a bed, a box of clothes, $31, and 2 things she would not sell. The first was her father's skimmer, not a bought one. He had made it himself out of a sheet of good copper hammered thin and dished, punched with holes, riveted to an ash handle 4 feet long, and 30 falls of use had worn the handle down in one place to the exact shape of a hand. That was what was in the long bundle in the flour sack. That was what she had carried under her elbow across half a continent and would not hand to a man on a depot platform, and if you want to know why a woman answers an advertisement from a country she has never seen, that skimmer is most of the answer. Because a person will go a long way to keep from becoming somebody who used to know how to do a thing. The second was a tin box the size of a Bible with a lid that fit tight, and in the tin box was seed cane. Not the cane the 17 men of Harrow County grew. Theirs was whatever their grandfathers had brought, run out and mixed and gone to seed with itself for 40 years until it was half-broom corn and made a thin, sour syrup that they all agreed was the best a man could expect. What was in Ephraim Hoyt's tin was early amber, kept clean and rogued by hand every fall for 11 years, and Sabra Hoyt could stand in a field of it in July and walk down a row and pull out the one stalk in 300 that was not right, and that is a thing you cannot learn out of any book. Early amber makes a light syrup. It ripens quick, and its roots go down after water like nothing else that grows in a plowed field. She planted the 12 acres in the last week of May. She broke it with the mules herself, which took her 11 days, because Gideon Renner was up on the ridge putting in his own corn, and she would not ask him, and he had the sense not to offer twice. She dragged it, and she smoothed it, and she laid it off in rows 3.5 feet apart with a marker she made out of a pole and 3 pegs, and she planted the seed thin in the row with her own hand, walking, a little at a time. A bushel and a peck of it over 12 acres. By then the whole county knew about it, because Ruth Dennard had ridden by on the Muddy Fork Road in the second week and seen her out there in the sun with the mules, and had gone straight to the store and told it. "Cane," he said, 12 acres of it, not a rod of corn, 12 acres of hog feed on the poorest sand on Renner's place. And her out there breaking it herself like she was 2 men and a boy. That got a laugh. It got a lot of laughs, in fact, and it got them for weeks, and it is worth understanding why. Because the men who laughed were not stupid men, and they were not entirely wrong on the arithmetic. Cane was not a crop in Harrow County. Cane was what you put in the corner of the corn ground so your wife could have molasses. Corn was the crop. Corn was money. Corn was fodder. Corn was what the elevator at Tallow Springs bought, and what the whole valley's year was hung on, and everybody knew what a man's ground would do in corn to the bushel, and everybody planted every acre he could get a plow into. And a woman who put 12 acres of the plainest ground on the Muddy Fork into sorghum cane in the spring of 1887 was, by every measure that valley had, throwing a season away. And there was the other thing under it, which nobody said in daylight, and everybody said after dark. She was a fat woman who had planted 12 acres of the sweetest crop God ever made, and a certain kind of man cannot let that alone. They made that joke in both saloons until it wore out. They made it in front of the schoolhouse and at the blacksmith's, and once on a Sunday close enough to the church steps that the preacher's wife turned around. It got back to her. Of course it got back to her. There is no such thing as a joke a woman does not hear in a county 9 miles across. She was in Teal's store on the first Saturday in June, buying coffee and a paper of pens and asking after the price of tin cans, when Ruth Dennard said it to Ambrose Teal across the counter, with her standing right there in the aisle. And Teal laughed, and one of the young Wexler boys laughed, and then they all looked at her to see what she would do. She finished her business. She counted her change into her palm and put it away. And on her way out she stopped at the end of the counter where the $17 sat. Because by then, the $17 had a home. It had started at the livery barn in the 3rd week of May, the day after Dennard came back with his news, and it had started as another joke, the way everything in that valley started. Somebody said she would not make a gallon. Somebody else said she would not make a quart. And Ruth Dennard, who liked to have a thing settled and countable, said he would put a silver dollar on it, and pulled one out, and slapped it down on the top of a feed bin and said, $1 says the fat bride does not make 1 gallon of syrup out of that patch, and who is with me? 16 more went down on that feed bin in about 4 minutes. They were the same. 17. Not one man different. The same 17 who had put in for the fair in January put in $1 apiece in May. And Ambrose Teal took his own hat off his own head and swept the money into it and carried it back to the store and set it on the shelf behind the counter, up between the horse liniment and the lamp chimneys, where every soul who came in for a paper of needles or a plug of tobacco would see it. And there it sat all summer. 17 silver dollars and a black hat, a whole crop year's worth of a joke sitting on a shelf at eye level in the one building in Harrow County that every family in Harrow County had to walk into. So when Saber Renner stopped at the end of that counter on the first Saturday in June with the laugh still going behind her, she was not looking at Ruth Dennard. She was looking up at the hat. She said, "Mr. Teal, is that money bet against me or on me?" Teal said, "Against, ma'am. Every dollar of it." She said, "Who holds it?" He said, "I do." She said, "Then I will want your word before witnesses, that you will hold it honest, and that when it is paid, it will be paid where it was bet. In here. In front of whoever is standing in here." Teal looked at her for a second, and then he smiled with his narrow mouth, because he thought he had been handed something. He said, "Ma'am, you have my word in front of these gentlemen. Every dollar of it paid over this counter in front of the house. And I will add that I hope you can stand to lose it, because I do not believe there is a soul in this county who thinks you will not." Nobody believed she would. That is the plain truth of it, and it ought to be said flat. Not one man in Harrow County, and not one woman either, believed that 12 acres of sorghum cane on sand ground in the driest spring anybody could remember was going to make anything at all, and if you had gone around that valley in June and asked them, the kindest of them would have said the poor creature does not know this country, and the rest would have said what they said in the saloons. She went out. She got up on the wagon seat and she drove home 9 miles, and she did not tell Gideon Renner about it that night or any other night, and he heard about it in July from the mail rider. And he came in at noon that day and stood in the door with his hat in his hand and said, "I have heard about a hat with money in it." She said, "You have." He said, "Do you want me to go down there?" And she stopped what she was doing at the stove and looked at him, and she understood exactly what he was offering, which was to go down that road and stand in Ambrose Teal's store until somebody said something in his hearing, and she also understood, because she was not a fool, that a man like Gideon Renner going down that road on her account would settle nothing at all. It would only move the joke somewhere she could not reach it. She said, "No," she said, "Mr. Renner, in October I will need a place for a mill, and a place for a furnace, and a great deal of wood. And I will need those things, whether or not any man in this county has been made to apologize to me in the meantime. If you want to be of use to me, and I believe you do, then haul me stone." He said, "Stone," she said, "creek stone. Flat, as much as those mules will pull, as many days as you can spare between now and cutting time, and I will build my own arch with it, and you will not lay one rock of it, because when it is done, and it works, I want it perfectly understood in this valley who built it." Gideon Renner put his hat back on. He said, "Ma'am, I will haul you stone until you tell me to quit." And he went out, and he did, and there is one more thing about that day that ought to be told, because it is the sort of thing that never gets into a story about a hard year. That night, after supper, he came in from the lean-to with a piece of ash he had been shaping for 2 evenings, and he set it on the table without a word, and it was a skimmer handle, cut and shaved and sanded smooth, a spare, in case the old one broke in the middle of a run. She turned it over in her hands for a while. She said, "That is a good piece of wood." He said, "It is the best I had." Neither one of them said anything else about it. But she kept it on the shelf over the bed where she could see it, and 30 years later, in a much bigger house on the same ground, it was still on a shelf where she could see it, and she still had not used it, because the old handle never did break. The rain quit on the 10th of June. It did not quit the way rain usually quits, with a week of high thin cloud and everybody saying it will break by Sunday. It quit the way a lamp goes out. There was a fine soaking rain on the 9th that everybody in Harrow County was glad of and talked about at church. 1.25 inches in Josiah Pike's rain gauge. The last honest rain that country would see for 11 weeks. And then the wind went around into the south and stayed there. By the last week of June, the corn on the Muddy Fork was knee-high and beginning to look wrong. There is a particular way corn goes in a dry year, and every farmer in that valley had seen it before and had told himself all spring that he would not see it again. First the leaves roll in the middle of the day, tight as a whip, and unroll again at evening, and a man tells himself that is only the plant being sensible. Then they stop unrolling at evening. Then the color goes out of them from the bottom of the stalk upward, a gray-green and then a straw color, and the bottom leaves fire and hang down dead and rattle. And the tassel comes out too soon and too small, and the silk comes out dry and brown. and there is no ear behind it, or there is an ear the length of a man's finger with 11 kernels on it, and that is your year. By the middle of July, there was nothing green on the ridges of Harrow County except the buffalo grass down in the draws and the cottonwoods where the creek still had water under the sand. And 12 acres of sorghum cane on the Renner bottom, standing dark green and shining. People noticed. People rode out of their way to notice. All through July, the Muddy Fork Road carried more traffic than it had ever carried. Men going up to look at their own burned corn and slowing down as they passed that flat piece of sand ground where the cane stood in rows a man could not see through. And every one of them said the same two things. He said, "Well, it will go the way of everything else by August." And then he said, "And what in the name of sense does she think she is going to do with it if it does not?" Both of those were fair questions. The second one was fairer than the first. Here is why the cane stood. Corn is a plant that grows fast and shallow and gambles everything on rain arriving in July, and when it does not arrive, corn cannot wait. It has no way to wait. It goes on trying to make an ear out of nothing until it kills itself. Sorghum cane is a plant out of Africa, and it has been dry before. Its roots go down twice as deep and go on going down. Its leaves roll shut in the heat, and it stops, and it does not die when it stops. It simply stands there with the works closed up, losing almost nothing, and it can stand that way for weeks. Then let one good rain come, or let a heavy dew run 3 nights, or let a plant's roots find the wet sand that is always down under a creek bottom, whether the creek is running or not, and it opens up and takes hold again where it left off. Her father had a sentence for it that he said every dry September of his life, and she said it out loud to herself twice a day that summer while she carried water to her garden, which was the only part of that place she could carry water to. Cane will wait. Corn will not. She did not say it to anybody in Tallow Springs. She had learned by the middle of June that there was no profit in explaining anything to that valley, because an explanation from her was heard as an excuse, and a woman making excuses in advance of a failure was exactly the thing they were all waiting to enjoy. So she said good morning to them, and she paid cash, and she went home. What she did instead was work, from before light until after dark, at 4 things. The first was the cane itself, which needed very little, but needed it on time. She went through those 12 acres twice with a hoe in June. In the last week of July, she walked every row of it with a sack over her shoulder and rogued it, pulling out by hand every stalk that had come up off type. The ones that branched wrong or headed too early or showed the red that meant the seed had crossed with something. And she pulled 240 of them out of 12 acres and carried them out to the end of the rows. And any man who watched her doing it, and several did, saw nothing but a heavy woman walking up and down in the heat, pulling up perfectly good-looking plants, which they took as more proof of what they already believed. The second was the arch. Gideon Renner hauled her creek stone all that summer, and he hauled it in the hours he could not work his own dying corn, which is to say most of the hours there were, because there is nothing a man can do for a field that has gone past saving except leave it alone. He brought flat limestone up out of the creek bed in the wagon, load after load, and he dumped it where she told him at the head of the cane field near the good spring, and he never laid one rock of it. She built the arch herself in July and August, in the coolest hours she could get, which was not cool. An arch is a furnace with no top on it. She dug it into the slope of the bank so that the firebox mouth faced into the prevailing wind and the flue end came out downhill, and she laid the 2 long side walls out of that flat stone. Dry laid and bedded in clay she dug out of the creek and tempered with straw, and she made them 13 feet long and a little under 3 feet apart and a little over 2 feet high, tapering the flue end so the draft would pull hot along the whole length instead of tearing straight through. She laid a firebox at the cold end with a stone throat and a bar grate she made out of 6 wagon tire irons. She built the walls dead level along the top on one side and a hair lower along the other. because a boiling pan wants a slight fall in it, so the syrup walks itself down toward the draw-off, and she checked that level with a long straight edge and a water glass, and she pulled down and relaid the last 4 feet of it twice, because it was out by less than the thickness of her thumb. That is a mason's job, and it took her 31 days, and she did it with her own hands and her own back, kneeling in the sun with clay to the elbow. A woman of 336 pounds getting up and down off the ground 400 times a day. She was slow at it. She was slower at it than a young man would have been, and she knew it and paid it no mind. And the wall she built was straight, and it is still there. The third thing was the pan, and the pan nearly ended everything. A sorghum evaporator pan is a shallow flat vessel, 12 or 13 feet long, 3 feet wide, 6 inches deep, with the joints riveted and soldered and the whole thing stiffened so it will not buckle over a fire, and it is made of copper or heavy tinned iron. And it costs more money than a woman who has $31 in the world and has spent 19 of it on seed and pins and coffee is going to lay her hands on in Harrow County, Kansas, in a crop failure summer. She wrote to St. Louis in June and got a price, and read it twice and put it in the stove. Then she went to Ambrose Teal. She went on a Saturday in the first week of August, and she waited until the store cleared, which took her the better part of 2 hours, and then she stood at the counter under the shelf where the black hat sat with the 17 silver dollars in it, and she asked Ambrose Teal a business question, plainly, the way one grown person asks another. She asked him what he would want for the use of his mill and his pan for 11 days in October after his own subscribers were through. And she offered him 1/4 of everything she made, which was a rich offer, and both of them knew it. Teal took his time. He wiped the counter. He said that the mill was a considerable investment and that his pan was the only pan in the county and that his subscribers depended on him. She said, 1/4, and I will do my own boiling and my own firing, and you will not lose an hour of your own work. And Ambrose Teal leaned on his counter and said the thing he had been saving since March. He said, Mrs. Renner, I will not run your cane. Not for 1/4 and not for 1/2. There is not a rod of cane on your place that any man in this county considers a crop, and I will not have my rollers and my pan tied up 11 days, making a laughingstock of my mill. Then he said, and I will tell you the rest of it for nothing, since you have asked me a straight question. There is not going to be any syrup made in Harrow County this fall. Not by you, and not by me. My subscribers' cane is burned as flat as their corn, and there will not be enough juice in this whole valley to wet the bottom of that pan, and the sooner you understand that this is a country that does not care what you did in Tennessee, the better off you will be. She stood there a moment. Then she said, Thank you. That is a plain answer, and I am obliged for it. And she went out and got up on the wagon and drove down to the far end of Tallow Springs to the freight house, where there was a sheriff's sale notice tacked to the door that had been there since May. The notice was for the personal property of a man named Cobb, who had given up on this country in the spring and gone back to Ohio owing money. And among the plows and harness and a broken windmill it listed 1 cane mill, iron, 3 rollers, damaged. She looked at it on the Saturday and bid on it on the Monday and got it for $11, because a broken cane mill in a county with no cane is worth about what the iron in it will bring, and even the man who bought the scrap iron did not want it. It was a good mill. That was the thing nobody else in that yard could see. It was a heavy 3-roller mill of the kind her father had run for 30 years, and what was wrong with it was that the near side burring block had cracked and the top roller had dropped out of line and chewed itself and been run that way, probably for a whole season, by a man who did not know what he was listening to. The gear teeth were battered on one face. The frame was true. She hauled it home in the wagon with Gideon Renner and a borrowed pry bar and 4 hours of the worst work either of them ever did in their lives, and then she spent 19 days on it. She trued the roller journals with a file, sitting on the ground, turning the roller a quarter turn at a time. She had the blacksmith at Tallow Springs forge a new bearing block, and she brought him the broken one and her own drawing on the back of a seed catalog, and when he handed her the new one, she stood in his shop and set it in place and took it out again and handed it back and said it wanted 2 30-seconds off the shoulder. And he took 2 30-seconds off the shoulder. And he told that story in Tallow Springs for the rest of his life, and it was the first time anybody in that county said out loud that the woman up the Muddy Fork knew what she was doing. She shimmed the rollers with sheet iron until the gap at the first squeeze was the thickness of a knife blade, and the gap at the second was the thickness of a piece of paper. She soaked the wooden sweep pole socket and drove it up tight. She greased everything. And on the 16th of September, with the cane still standing in the field and the whole valley burned brown around it, she chocked the mill on a bed of tamped stone at the head of her field, 12 steps from the arch she had built with her own hands. And she put the sweep pole in and hooked the mules to it and ran 1 armload of green cane through it to see. And the juice came out of the spout into a bucket, and it was green and cloudy and cold, and it tasted the way her father's mill's juice had tasted when she was 9 years old. She sat down on the ground next to a 50-cent bucket of cane juice in a burned-up county with $9 to her name, and she put her hands over her face, and there was nobody there to see her do it, and it did not last long. And the pan? The pan came out of the county seat in the last week of September, and it came out of the one place in 11 counties where such a thing was sitting idle, which was the back lot of a wrecked-out sorghum works at Ash Bend that had gone under in the panic 4 years before. She had gone looking for it. She had spent 2 days asking questions in a town where she knew nobody, and she found a man who told her about the Ash Bend works, and she found the widow who owned what was left of them. And she stood in a weed lot with that woman and looked at a 13-foot pan lying upside down in the sunflowers with a seam split at one end. The widow at Ash Bend wanted $8. Sabra Renner had 9. She paid the 8 and hauled it home and soldered the seam herself over a charcoal fire with a copper iron and a stick of solder that cost her 40 cents, and set it on the arch she had built and filled it with creek water to the depth of 2 inches to check the fall, and stood at the flue end and watched the water lie perfectly even from one end of that pan to the other, exactly as level as she had built it, and then she opened the draw off at the low corner, and every drop of that water walked itself down the pan and out. She was ready on the 29th of September, and she had $1.60 left, and there was not a cloud anywhere over Kansas. And 9 miles down the Muddy Fork Road, in a store with a black hat on the shelf, men were still betting she would not make a gallon. To understand what happened in Harrow County that October, you have to understand how completely the corn had gone, because a stranger reads the word drought and thinks of a thin crop, and that is not what it was. The crop was lost. Not short. Lost, Rufe Dennard, who had the best ground and the best team and had put in 310 acres, cut every stalk of it for fodder in the last week of August because there was no ear worth picking, and the fodder itself was so light and dry it blew off the wagon. Josiah Pike got 11 bushels off of 60 acres. The Wexlers got nothing at all and turned their cattle into it. There was no corn to sell, which meant no cash money coming into that valley in the fall, which meant no notes paid at the bank at the county seat, which meant that by the middle of September Ambrose Teal had stopped selling anything on credit to anybody and had a list on the wall of his back room of the men who owed him and how long they had owed it. And there was no sweetening. That is the part that a person 100 years later does not think of, and it was the part that mattered. Sugar came from a long way off, and it came by rail, and it had to be paid for in cash at the counter. Teal's barrel held white sugar at 22 cents a pound that fall, and there was not a family on the Muddy Fork outside of 3 that could put down cash for sugar in a year when they had nothing to sell. What a family in that country used all winter was molasses, and molasses out of a barrel from St. Louis was 55 cents a gallon, plus the freight, and the freight was the killing part. And what everybody actually used was their own sorghum, made at Teal's mill in October out of their own little patch, a barrel or two of it in the cellar, and it went on the biscuits, and in the coffee, and in the beans, and in the gingerbread, and in the vinegar keg, and on the children's bread and butter twice a day, every day, from November to May. And that year the little patches failed. They failed for a reason that had nothing to do with the weather being unfair to some men and kind to others, and Saber Renner could have told any one of them what the reason was if any one of them had asked. They planted their cane in the corner of the corn ground, up on the thin upland where the sand was shallow over hardpan. They planted seed their grandfathers had brought, run out and crossed with itself for 2 generations until half of it headed like broomcorn. They planted it thick and let it go and never touched it again, and in a wet year it made a thin sour syrup they all called good enough, and in that year, with 11 weeks of no rain on ground that had nothing under it, it stood 2.5 feet high with no juice in it worth the crushing. Teal's mill did not turn a wheel that October. He put it out that he had decided against running on account of the poor quality of the county's cane, and that was true as far as it went. The rest of the truth, which the liveryman knew and passed along, was that a 3-roller mill wants a strong horse or a strong mule walking a sweep in a circle 8 and 10 hours a day, and Ambrose Teal's team, like nearly every team in Harrow County that fall, was thin as a rail and going into winter on cottonwood leaves and burned corn fodder, and he was not going to work them down to nothing for 100 gallons of sour syrup. So there sat a valley of families with no corn, no cash, no sugar, and no molasses going into a Kansas winter. And there stood 12 acres of early amber on the Renner bottom, 11 feet high, so heavy and so thick a man could get lost in it, the only green field in Harrow County. They had stopped laughing about it in September. That is worth saying, because it did not turn into respect, not yet, not for a long while. It turned into something meaner and quieter. Men rode past that field and looked at it and did not say anything, and then they went to the store and were harder to be around. There is a particular ugly feeling that comes over people who have laughed at somebody all summer and then have to watch that somebody stand in the one green field in the county, and it is not shame. Shame comes later, if it comes. What comes first is anger, and a hunt for a reason why it is not fair. The reason they settled on was the creek. It was the creek water, they said. It was the sand and the seep out of that spring, and Renner had given her the one piece of ground in the valley that could not fail, and any fool could grow anything on bottom land like that, and it had nothing to do with her at all. They said it in both saloons, and they said it at the blacksmith shop, and they believed it, and it was not even close to true. Because there were 9 other pieces of creek bottom on the Muddy Fork just as good, and not one of them had a single stalk of cane on it that fall, and every one of those 9 men had been standing on the depot platform in March. On the 4th of October, the wind came up out of the southwest hard enough to lay the grass over flat, and at about 11 in the morning, the Prairie Southerns eastbound dropped a cinder in the right-of-way 3 miles west of the Renner place and set the prairie on fire. Everybody who has lived in that country knows what that means, and nobody who has not can be made to understand it. A prairie fire in a drought year with a hard wind behind it does not creep. It comes at the speed of a horse at a gallop with a wall of smoke ahead of it, and it makes a sound. She saw the smoke before she smelled it, from the top of the ridge behind the house, where she had gone to look at the sky the way she had looked at the sky every day since June. She stood there long enough to be sure of the line it was running, and it was running straight down the valley, and it would be in her cane in about 40 minutes. Gideon Renner was gone. He had taken the wagon and both mules to the county seat that morning after wire and salt, and would not be back before dark, which he never once forgave himself for, and which was not his fault, and which she never once let him say a word about afterward. So there was one woman on that place, and there were 12 acres to save. She did not run for the neighbors, because the nearest neighbor was 2.5 miles down the road, and by the time anybody got there, it would be over. She did not try to fight the head of it, because a person who tries to fight the head of a grass fire in a hard wind dies, and she knew that. She took the one team she had, which was the milk cow, hitched with a chain to a green cottonwood log she and Gideon had dragged up in August for firewood and never split. She started at the creek at the west end of her field, and she plowed fire. You do it by burning a strip yourself, ahead of the fire, back against the wind, so that when the big fire arrives there is nothing left in front of it, and you do it by dragging that burning strip along under control with wet sacks and a green log and your own 2 hands, and it is the most dangerous work there is in that country, and men have died at it in pairs. She wet down 4-grained sacks in the creek and hung them over the cow's chain, and she lit her back fire at the edge of the road with a twist of grass, and she walked it 1/2 mile alone, in a rising wind, beating the wrong side of her own fire out with a wet sack in each hand, while the other side ate west into the wind at a walking pace and made her a black strip 40 yards wide between the prairie and her cane. It took her a little over half an hour, and the big fire caught up with her while she was still working the last 200 yards. She heard it come. It came up out of the draw west of the field with a roar like a train in a cut, and it hit the edge of her burn, and it stood up there in a wall, 30 feet of flame going straight up, because there was nothing in front of it to go forward into, and it ran north and south along the line of her black strip looking for a way in, and there was no way in, and it went around her. It burned the west half of the rennet corn on the upland, and it burned Josiah Pike's fence line, and it burned 9 miles of grass down the valley before the wind quit at dark, and it did not put 1 spark into that cane field, because a heavy woman with a wet sack and a milk cow had done in 35 minutes what 4 men with a plow would have been proud of. When Gideon Renner came up the road at 9 o'clock that night, he could see the black by starlight, and he came off that wagon before it stopped rolling. He found her sitting on the ground at the end of the rows, with her back against the cold stone of her arch and both hands lying palm up in her lap, and her sleeves burned off at the elbow, and her face black to the eyes except where the sweat had run. He got down on his knees in front of her, a thing that man had likely not done since he was a boy, and he took her wrists and turned her hands over and looked at them. He said, "Sabra." It was the first time he had said her name. She said, "The cane is all right." He said, "I do not care about the cane." And she said, "Well, I do." And then she started to laugh, and it turned into something else halfway through. And he sat down on the ground beside her in the ashes and put his arm around her shoulders, and the 2 of them sat there in the dark for a long time, and neither one said anything more about it. The next morning she was out at daylight with her hands wrapped in strips of a petticoat, hoeing the fire line wider. The whole county heard about the fire, of course. What the whole county heard was that the Prairie Southern had set the valley off, and that it had burned 9 miles, and that it had been stopped at the Renner place. 2 or 3 men who rode out to look at the burn on the Wednesday could read the ground perfectly well, and knew exactly what had been done there and how, and they went home and told their wives and did not say it in the store. Rufus Dennard rode out on the Thursday. He sat his horse on the road at the end of that black strip for a good while, with his hands crossed on the horn, looking at the burned line and the unburned cane, and the milk cow standing in the corral with the chain still on her, working it out. Then he rode into Tallow Springs and stood at the counter and said, in front of 6 men and the black hat on the shelf, that the fire had missed the Renner place by pure blind luck, and that anything a person put up against this country was luck, and that it did not signify a thing. Nobody in the store said anything back to him, but the liveryman, telling it that night, said Dennard's voice had gone up at the end of it like a man arguing with somebody who was not there. Cane is cut when the seed in the head has gone from milk to dough, and not before, and there is no arguing with it, and the whole business has to be done in a hurry, because a hard freeze in the field will sour standing cane in one night and turn a year's work into hogwash. She began on the 11th of October. Cutting cane is not like cutting wheat. Every stalk has to be handled 3 times by hand. First it is stripped, which means the leaves are knocked off the standing stalk with a wooden knife, and the leaves have to come off because they are what makes syrup bitter and green tasting. Then the head is cut off, the seed head with a knife, and thrown in a pile. Then the stalk is cut at the ground and laid in a windrow, butts all one way, so it can be gathered and hauled. 12 acres of 11-foot cane, standing as thick as her arm and heavier than it looks, is somewhere near 400 tons of green stalk on the ground before it has gone 1 foot toward a mill. She had figured on doing it with 2 hands and a mule and 30 days, and she was 2 days into it when the widow Cora Sipe came up the Muddy Fork Road in a wagon with her 2 grown sons. Cora Sipe had buried a husband in April and had a quarter section with nothing on it, and her boys were 19 and 21, and none of the 3 of them had been on the depot platform in March because they had been at the burying. She pulled up at the end of the rows and sat there and watched for a while. Then she called out, "Mrs. Renner, what do you pay?" Sabra came out of the cane with the strip knife in her hand and her sleeves rolled and stood at the wagon wheel and looked up at her. She said, "I have got $1.60. Cora Sipe said, "That is not what I asked you." And Sabra Renner said, "I will pay a share. 1 gallon in every 10 that comes off this ground, paid in the jug. And I will feed whoever works, and if it makes nothing, you will have lost your time, and I will have lost my ear. And I will not pretend to you that it is a sure thing, because down at that store they have got money in a hat that says it is not." Cora Sipe got down off the wagon. She was a small, dry, hard-handed woman who came up to about the middle of Sabra's upper arm. She said, "My man used to say a fool and a stranger are the only 2 that will try a new thing in a bad year, and he is dead and I am neither one, so I expect I had better hurry." She said, "Boys, get the knives." There were 5 of them in that field after that, counting Gideon Renner, who cut the upland corn stubble in the morning and came down and worked cane until dark, and there is no way to make the next 3 weeks sound like anything but what they were, which was the hardest work any of them had ever done. They were in the field before it was light enough to see the rows, and they came out of it after dark. Cane leaves cut like paper, and every one of them had forearms crossed with fine red lines that stung when the sweat got in. The seed heads went into a heap the size of a haystack, worth more than any of them yet knew. The stripped stalks went into windrows, and the windrows went onto the wagon, and the wagon went up to the head of the field by the mill. And the pile there grew until it was a wall of green cane 20 feet through and higher than a man's head, and every single day people came to watch. That is a thing that has to be said plainly. Not one man from Tallow Springs came out with a knife. Not one. They came out on horseback and in wagons on their way to somewhere they did not need to go, and they pulled up on the road at the end of the field, and they sat and looked. And some days there were 2 of them, and some days there were 9, and they would sit up there on that road with their hands crossed on the saddle horns for a quarter of an hour at a time, watching a heavy woman and a widow and 2 boys strip cane in the heat. Then they rode on. Sometimes something got said. A young Wexler, riding by with 2 others, called out something across the field about the price of lard, and the older of the Simpa boys straightened up with his knife in his hand, and Cora Sipe said, "Elmer, cut cane." They came because they could not stay away. Every one of those men was looking at the only feed and the only sweetening in Harrow County and doing the arithmetic in his head and hating the arithmetic. The first light frost came on the night of the 20th of October, and she had 8 acres cut and windrowed and 4 acres still standing, and she had gone out that afternoon and looked at the sky and smelled the air and said, "We cut tonight." They cut by lantern light from dark until 3 in the morning, all 5 of them, and the frost came at 4. And it was a light frost that took the tops off the pigweed and did not hurt the cut cane in the windrow at all. 4 hours later she was firing the arch. The milling began on the 21st of October, and it is the part of the story that gets told wrong every time it gets told, so it is worth setting down exactly the way it happened. Because there were 14 witnesses to it, and every one of them told it the same way for the rest of their lives. A 3-roller cane mill works like this. There are 3 iron rollers standing upright in a heavy frame geared together at the top, and a wooden sweep pole 13 feet long fixed to the center roller, and the far end of the sweep is hitched to a horse or a mule that walks a circle around the mill all day. A hand feed stalks into the first gap. They come out flat and pass around into the second gap and come out flatter. And the juice runs down the frame into a spout and out through a strainer into a barrel, and what comes out the far side is the crushed stalk, which is called pomace, and it is thrown on a heap. The mule they hitched to that sweep on the morning of the 21st was named Judith, and she was 13 years old, and she had walked 140 miles that summer hauling creek stone, and she had wintered and summered on burned grass like every other animal in Harrow County, and she was, by the 3rd week of October, a thin, willing, worn-out mule. Judith made it until noon. At noon she came around the circle and stopped, and would not lean into the pole any more, and she stood there with her head down and her sides going. And Saber Renner unhooked her without one word of complaint, and led her out, and rubbed her down, and put her in the corral. And that was the end of mule power on that place, because the other mule, Solomon, had gone lame in the near shoulder hauling the pan up from Ash Bend in September, and could not pull a hat off a table. They had 400 tons of cut cane on the ground. Cut cane sours. Once the stalk is down, a maker has, in warm weather, about 4 days before the juice goes off, and the whole thing is fit for nothing. And there was cut cane in that field that had been down for a week already, because they had cut ahead of the frost. The 2 Sippe boys took the sweep. They were young and strong, and they took hold of the end of that pole the way 2 young men do, and they leaned into it, and the mill turned. It turned for about 11 minutes. The trouble with a cane mill is not the turning, it is the starting. Over and over. Because a green stalk going into the first gap is a solid thing, and the rollers bind on it and stop, and each time they stop, somebody has to break them loose against the whole weight of the gearing and the stalk both. And a man does that by throwing himself against the pole in a lunge. And a lunge takes everything a man has got, and there are 1,100 of them in a day. By 2 o'clock those boys were done. The older one sat down on the ground with his arms shaking and could not hold a cup. Cora Sippe took the pole. She weighed 109 pounds, and she got it turning twice and could not break it loose the 3rd time. And she stood there hanging her whole small body off the end of that pole with her feet off the ground, and it did not move. And that is when Saber Renner walked out and took the sweep. There were, as it happened, an audience for it. There were 6 men sitting their horses on the road that afternoon, because word had gone around that the milling was starting, and Rufe Dennard was one of them. And 2 of the 17 were with him. And the Prairie Southern section foreman had walked over from the track, and the mail rider had stopped, and one of them, years later, when he was an old man and telling it to his grandsons at a fair in Tallow Springs, said that what he remembered was that nobody up on that road said one word, and that ordinarily there was always somebody saying something. She put both hands on the end of the pole where the sight boys had worn the wood smooth. She was, in the way that mattered on that particular afternoon, 336 pounds of woman, and there is a thing about a heavy body that a light body cannot borrow and cannot fake, which is that it does not have to fight for purchase. A 109-pound woman hanging off the end of a sweep pole is trying to move 1,000 pounds of iron with 109 pounds of leverage, and her boots slide. A young man of 160 can do it with a lunge, and can do it 1,100 times if he is fresh, and cannot do it 1,100 times 2 days running. She set her feet in the beaten circle, and she put her shoulder into that pole, and she did not lunge at it at all. She leaned. She leaned her whole body onto the pole the way you lean a wagon over a chock, and the weight went out of her boots and into the wood and into the gearing, and the iron came off the bind with a knock you could hear at the road. And the rollers turned, and the juice came down the spout, and she kept leaning, and she walked. She walked that circle for 4 hours without stopping. She walked it the next day for 9 hours with 2 rests. She walked it the day after that from before daylight until 9 o'clock at night, and the day after that, and the day after that, 23 days in all, and the men on the road came back and came back and came back, and the story got down to Tallow Springs the first night and was in both saloons by the second, and it did not come out as a joke. And that was the first time all year that a story about her had failed to come out as a joke. The Seep boys fed the mill and hauled cane. Cora Seepy strained the juice and carried it in buckets and kept the fire. Gideon Renner cut wood, which nobody should underestimate, because an arch under a 13-foot pan eats a wagon load of split wood a day, and there were no trees in Harrow County to speak of except along that creek. And he cut and split and hauled from before light until after dark for 3 weeks, and lost 11 pounds doing it. And the woman who had been paid to come out from Tennessee so that 17 men could laugh at her body on a public platform used that body all day, every day, for 23 days to turn an iron mill that no other person on that place could turn. Nobody who saw it ever got the picture out of their head. 2 of the men who watched from the road went home and did the one useful thing they could think of, which was to send a boy up with a sack of coffee. One of them was Josiah Pike. The other was a man named Elias Bowe, who had put a silver dollar in that hat in May, and who would, before the month was out, do something about it. The mill is the muscle of a sorghum works. The pan is the mind of it, and the pan was hers alone, and she did not let one other human being touch it for 23 days. She fired the arch at first light, and she did not let it go out. Green juice went into the cold end of that pan out of the settling barrel, run in slow through a strainer of clean sacking so that the sand and the field trash and the bits of leaf stayed behind. And it started to move down the pan toward the fire, and as it warmed it threw up its first scum, a coarse green mat that came up all at once like a blanket, and that had to come off within a minute of its rising, or it would break up and go back into the juice and be in the syrup forever. That is what the skimmer is for. Her father's skimmer was a dished sheet of hammered copper punched full of holes on an ash handle 4 feet long, with a worn place shaped like a hand, and she stood at that pan in the smoke with it and skimmed, and skimmed, and skimmed. 10 hours, 12 hours, 16 hours on the long days at the end when the cut cane was souring in the field and she would not stop. The green scum went into a bucket, and the bucket went to the hogs, which by the second week was every hog on the Muddy Fork. Because she sent word down that any family that wanted skimmings could come get them free and bring their own bucket, and 11 families came, and that was the first time in 7 months that anybody from Tallow Springs drove up the Muddy Fork Road with an errand instead of an audience. The juice worked its way down the pan and got thicker and paler, and the scum changed as it went, coarse green to fine tan to a light foam, and at the hot end, in the last 4 feet, it stopped being juice and started being syrup, and it went the color of a new penny held up to a window, and that is where she lived. Every few minutes, all day, she lifted the skimmer up out of the hot end and turned it sideways in the light and watched how the syrup came off the edge of it, thin and running in a stream, and it was not ready, and it went back down the pan. And then, 3 or 4 times a day, the whole pan changed. The bubbles at the hot end went from small and quick to big and slow and made a heavier sound, and the smell came up out of it and turned, and if you have never smelled a sorghum pan turn, there is nothing to compare it to. It is not a sugar smell. It is a deep, dark, warm, half-burnt, buttery, grassy smell that gets in the back of a person's throat and stays in their clothes and their hair and does not wash out for a week. And when it goes out on a cold morning across a valley where nobody has had anything sweet in the house since June, it does not smell like food. It smells like being taken care of. She had about half a minute from the turn of that smell. She would go up on her toes and look down the pan, and then she would say, "Now." And Cora Seepy would pull the draw off gate at the low corner, and 13 feet of pan would walk itself down and out through a fine strainer into a bucket. and the syrup that came out of it hung on the lip of the skimmer and let go in a broad sheet like an apron off a line, and the last of the sheet broke into a flake that curled over on itself. That flake was the whole thing. That was 30 falls of Ephraim Hoyt's life and 20 years of his daughter's, and there was not another human being inside of 200 miles who could read it. The first gallon came off the pan at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 21st of October, and there is no record of what she said when it did, because Cora Sipey was at the draw-off, and the boys were at the mill, and Gideon Renner was up the creek with the axe, and by the time anybody looked up, she had already poured it into a stone jug and set the jug on a flat rock and gone back to the pan. What is recorded? Because the mail rider carried it down, and it went through Tallow Springs like a grass fire itself, is what happened on the 23rd. That was the day the wind came around out of the north. It had been in the south and the southwest since June, and on the 23rd it swung around cold and steady out of the north, straight down the Muddy Fork Valley, over an arch with a 13-foot pan on it going full, and it carried the smell of that syrup 9 miles down the valley into Tallow Springs, Kansas, and put it into every house in that town at about 10 in the morning. Ivy Teal smelled it in her own kitchen and went out on her porch. The schoolteacher opened a window and had to give up on arithmetic for the morning because there were 19 children in that room, and every one of them was gone from the neck up. The blacksmith smelled it at the forge and stood there with the hammer down. Old men came out on the steps of both saloons, and nobody had to be told what it was. Not one soul, because there is exactly one thing in this world that smells like that, and every person in that county had known it since they were small, and this year there had been none of it anywhere. Not a jug, not a drop, and here it came down the valley on a north wind out of the one field nobody had thought was worth planting. Ambrose Teal came out of his store onto the walk with his apron on and stood there in the cold and smelled it too, and the liveryman, who had no love for him, said afterward that Teal stood there a long time and that his face did a thing the liveryman had never seen it do. The first wagon came up the Muddy Fork Road that afternoon. It was Josiah Pike, with his hat in his hand before he was off the seat, and what he wanted was to buy syrup, and what he said, standing there at the end of the rows with the mill knocking and the pan going, was that he had 4 children and had not had a sweet thing in the house since the middle of the summer, and he had no cash money at all, and would she take work? She said, "What can you do?" He said, "I can swing an axe." She said, "Then go up the creek and find the big man and tell him I said you are to cut wood, and you will cut wood until Saturday, and Saturday you will go home with 3 gallons. Josiah Pike cut wood for 4 days and went home with 3 gallons in stone jugs and a gunny sack in the bottom of his wagon, and his wife made gingerbread with it that night. And his youngest, who was 5 years old, ate a piece of it and cried. And Josiah Pike sat at his own table and put his hand over his eyes. He told that story in the store. He told it in a room with a black hat full of silver dollars sitting on the shelf over his head. And he told it looking straight at Ambrose Teal, and when he was done, he said one more thing, which was, that woman built her own furnace out of creek rock, and she is walking that sweep herself because her mule give out, and there is not a man in this room could walk it a day, and I have been sick to my stomach with myself since Tuesday. Nobody answered him. Then on the 26th, Rufe Dennard came up the road. He came up because he had come to some private arrangement with himself about needing to see it, and he brought a wagon and a story about wanting to look at the seed heads with an eye toward buying seed in the spring. And he stood around at the edge of the works for the better part of an hour without buying anything and without helping. What happened at about 3 in the afternoon, and it happened because of an ordinary piece of carelessness of the kind that kills people on farms every year. The cane wagon was backed up to the mill and loaded high and heavy, and the near wheel was standing in the soft ground where the juice and the wash water had been running for 5 days. And Rufe Dennard was on the load pitching cane down to the feed hand, and the ground gave under that near wheel, and the wagon went over sideways. It took the sweep circle with it. The end of the 13-foot sweep pole was caught by the falling load, and the pole came around and down, and the whole load of green cane and the wagon box and the pole came down on top of Rufe Dennard, who had jumped the wrong way, which is the way a heavy man on top of a shifting load nearly always jumps. When the noise stopped, he was on his face in the mud between the wagon box and the mill frame, with the butt end of the sweep pole across his hips and about a third of a load of green cane on top of that, and he was pinned from the waist down. And his own weight was 240 pounds, and the pole was oak, and the load was a great deal more than that, and he could not get any air in to holler with. The sight boys got there first and could not lift it. That is not a criticism of them. They were 19 and 21 years old and strong, and they got under that pole where it crossed him, and they lifted with everything they had, and it came up perhaps 2 inches and settled again, and he made a sound. The older boy started yelling for a jack. There was no jack. The jack was in the wagon that was lying on its side, and Sabra Renner came out of the smoke at the pan with the skimmer still in her hand. She dropped the skimmer. She looked at the way that pole lay and where the load was bearing, and she put the boys where she wanted them, one at his shoulders and one clearing cane, and then she got both hands under the butt of that oak pole. And she squatted down in the mud beside a pinned man with her back straight and her feet planted the way her father had taught her to pick up the end of a mill roller when she was 15 years old, and she stood up. The pole came up off Rufe Dennard's back 1.5 feet. She held it there. She held it there with her arms shaking and her boots going down into the wet ground while the Sipey boys dragged him out by the shoulders and his belt buckle plowed a furrow in the mud, and when he was clear she let it down easy, because a person who drops a thing like that can break something in a man who is already broken. And then she sat down flat on the ground because her legs had quit. Rufe Dennard had 2 cracked ribs and a hip that gave him trouble the rest of his life, and he was in her house for 9 days because he could not be hauled home over that road, and Cora Seep and the widow's boys carried him in, and there was not a bed in that house but the one, and Sabra Renner slept on the bench by the stove for 9 nights and went out and walked the sweep every one of those days. He lay in that bed and looked at that sod ceiling for 9 days. On the 3rd day he said, "Ma'am," and she said, "Do not talk yet." On the 6th day he said it again, and she came and stood at the foot of the bed with her hands on her hips and let him say it. He said, "In May I put $1 in that hat and said you would not make a gallon." She said, "I know what you said." I was told it word for word. He said, "I have been trying since Tuesday to think how a man gets out from under a thing like that, and I cannot see how he does." And Sabra Renner said, "You do not get out from under it. You get up and you go tell it. That is the whole of it. There is no other road out of that field." He did not say much after that, but a man flat on his back in a one-room house for 9 days sees everything that happens in it. And what Rufe Dennard saw in those 9 days did more to him than any speech could have. He saw her come in at midnight or 1/2 with her apron scorched and her forearms red to the elbow and the smell of the pan in her hair, and eat standing up at the stove out of a bowl, and look in on him to see if he wanted water, and then lie down on a bench with a rolled coat under her head. He saw her get up again at 3:30 and make bread in the dark. He saw, on the 2nd night, the reason a pan cannot be left. There is a thing that happens in a sorghum run when the wind changes at night and the draft comes up in the arch and the fire runs hotter than it has run all day, and if there is nobody standing at the hot end at that moment, the syrup goes past the flake and catches on the pan bottom, and the whole run in that pan is bitter and black. The wind came around at about 11 o'clock on the 27th, and she was out that door before Cora Sipey had the lamp lit. And she stood at that pan by lantern light until 4 in the morning, drawing off a little at a time and running cold juice in at the top to hold it back. And she saved every gallon, and she came in at 4 with her hands shaking and looked in on him and said, "Do you want water?" He saw the line start on the 28th from the window by the bed. He saw a woman he had made a joke of for 6 months fill a lard pail for a family that had nothing to trade and write their name in a copybook and tell them, in the spring, and mean it. And on the seventh day he heard something out of that window that he told for the rest of his life, which was the sound of 11 or 12 people standing in a line in the cold outside a stranger's house, and one of them laughing at something somebody said, and then the whole line laughing, and Rufe Dennard lay there in a borrowed bed with 2 cracked ribs, and understood all at once and completely that a joke can go one of 2 ways in a small country place, and that they had spent a whole year on the wrong one. There was a night in that stretch that ought to be set down as well, because Cora Sipe told it, and Cora Sipe was not a woman who decorated a story. On the 5th of November, a man named Halloran came up the Muddy Fork Road in the dark on a mule, with no saddle, from a place 7 miles the other side of Tallow Springs. And Halloran had not been on the platform in March, and had never met any of them in his life. He had a wife down with a pneumonia and 4 children, and there was no doctor to be got that night, and nothing in the house but cornmeal, and somebody in Tallow Springs had told him that the woman up the Muddy Fork would not turn anybody off. He got there at 11 at night and stood in the door with his hat in his hands and could barely get the words out. She was at the pan. She had been at the pan since daylight. She put a jug of syrup and a loaf and half a ham and a paper of tea in a sack and put the sack in his hands, and she would not take his money. And then she went and got Gideon Renner up out of the lean-to, and Gideon Renner saddled the gray and rode 9 miles to Tallow Springs and another 11 to the county seat in the dark, and brought a doctor back to Halloran's place by 7 in the morning, and paid him out of his own pocket. And that woman lived, and there were 4 Halloran children in Harrow County who grew up being told every single winter of their childhood exactly who it was that had not turned their father off at 11 o'clock at night in the middle of a syrup run. That is the other half of what people mean when they talk about that fall in that county, and it does not fit on a card in a museum case. She was the only person in Harrow County who could read a pan. That is a fact, and it is the reason the syrup got made. But there were plenty of skilled people in that valley, and skill by itself has never made anybody beloved. What made the difference was that in a year when everybody had a reason to close the door and count what was left. She kept a rule nailed to a post at the end of her rows that said no family goes without, and she never once, not one time, all that fall and all that winter, made a single person who came up that road feel like a beggar for standing there. Cora Sipe put it the plainest years later when the county history man came around with his notebook and asked her what Mrs. Renner had been like in those days, expecting, probably, something about the mill. Cora Sipe said she never let anybody stand at that door hungry, and she never let anybody stand at that door ashamed, and I would not know how to say which of the 2 was the bigger job. Rufe Dennard went home on the 4th of November in a wagon bed full of straw, and the first thing he did when he could stand up straight was to walk into Ambrose Teal's store on a Saturday afternoon with about 20 men in it and tell it. All of it. From the letter in January to the poll in October, standing there with one hand on the counter to keep the weight off his hip. But by then the line had already started. It started on the 28th of October, the day after the smell came down the valley the second time, and it started with 2 wagons, and it never stopped again that fall. They came up the Muddy Fork Road in the cold, with jugs and crocks and washtubs and empty coal oil cans scrubbed out with lye. And they came with what they had to trade because there was no cash money in Harrow County that year, and what they had to trade was work and goods and the odds and ends of a hard season. A man brought a set of harness. A woman brought 2 dozen jars of tomatoes she had put up in July out of the only garden that had not burned, and stood at the end of the rows and asked, with her chin up, whether that would do. Somebody brought a keg of nails. Somebody brought a hog. Sabra Renner set her price on the second day of the line, and she never moved it, up or down, for anybody all fall. She sold sorghum at $1.40 the gallon. That was a fair price, and every person in that county knew it was a fair price, because barreled molasses out of St. Louis was 55 cents plus a freight rate that ran it well past $1.50 by the time it sat on Teal's floor, and there was none of it on Teal's floor anyway. She could have had $4, That is not a guess. By the middle of November, there were men driving in from 2 counties over, and one of them, a buyer out of the county seat, stood at her arch in the smoke and offered her $4 a gallon for the whole make. Cash, on the spot, and offered to take it away in his own wagons, and she said no. She said, "This is Harrow County syrup, and it is going on Harrow County's tables. And it is $1.40, and you may buy 10 gallons like anybody else." And she made one rule, and she stuck to it, and Cora Sipey wrote it out on a shingle and nailed the shingle to the post at the end of the rows where the line formed, and every person who stood in that line all fall read it while they waited. It said, "No family goes without. Pay in cash or in work or in kind or in the spring." She kept a ledger. It was a school copybook, and she kept it on the shelf over the bed, and she wrote in it every night by lamplight with her hand stiff, and in it went every gallon that left that place, and what was paid for it, and what was owed on it. And there were 41 names in that book by Christmas, with nothing written in the paid column. And every one of those 41 was settled by the following August, and 11 of them were settled in work, and 2 were never settled at all, because both men died, and she drew a line through those 2 names and wrote one word beside them, which was the word paid. 812 gallons came off that pan between the 21st of October and the 12th of November. 12 acres of sand ground that the whole valley had laughed at in May, in the driest summer in the history of that county, made 812 gallons of light amber sorghum syrup, and she made every gallon of it herself at a pan she leveled with her own hands on an arch she laid with her own hands. Out of cane she planted, rogued, cut, and crushed by leaning 336 pounds of her own body against an oak pole for 23 days. And that was not even the whole of what came off those 12 acres. There was the seed. That haystack of cut seed heads at the end of the field that nobody had thought about at all was 1,100 pounds of clean early amber seed cane after she had threshed it out with a flail on a wagon sheet in the evenings, and there was not another pound of it in the state of Kansas that anybody could put a hand on. And in a county where every man had just watched his grandfathers run out cane make nothing and her seed make 812 gallons, that seed was worth more per pound than the syrup was per gallon. She sold it in the spring at a price, and she gave away better than a third of it, and she did one other thing with it that mattered more, which will come in a moment. And there was the fodder. The stripped leaves and the tops and the crushed pomace off the mill made a heap at the end of that field the size of a barn, and it was feed. Not good feed. Feed in a county where every haystack was empty and every corn crib was empty, and men were going into November trying to winter horses on burned corn stalks and cottonwood branches. A mountain of sorghum fodder was the difference between having a team in the spring and walking behind a borrowed one. She sold that fodder for what it cost her to have it hauled, and there were 11 farms on the Muddy Fork that put a team through that winter on it, and one of them was Ambrose Teal's. The first hard frost, the killing frost that ends everything, came on the 8th of November, and by first frost, every one of the 17 cane growers who had bet against her had stood in the line at her door. All 17 of them lined up at her door for sorghum with a jug in their hands and paid her $1.40 a gallon for it like everybody else. They did not come all at once, and they did not come together, because a man does not want witnesses for a thing like that. They came 1 and 2 at a time over 11 days, in the cold, with their jugs, and they took their place in a line of 30 people that ran from the shingle at the end of the rows up past the mill to the arch. And they stood there among their neighbors and shuffled forward, and every one of them had to walk the last 10 steps past that mill with the beaten circle around it and the smooth place, worn on the end of the sweep pole where her hands went, and then stand in front of her. Some of them could not say anything at all. Elias Bowie, who had sent up the coffee, got to the front of the line and set his jug down and started to speak, and had to stop and stand there with his jaw working, and she filled his jug and set it in his hands and said, quietly, so that the line behind him would not hear it, "Mr. Bow, Take your syrup home to your wife." The young Wexler who had called out about the price of lard came with his hat off. Josiah Pike came back 4 times and cut wood every time. The blacksmith came and would not take pay for the bearing block. 2 of them tried to hand her money over the price, and she would not take it. And one of them, a man named Kittredge, said, "Ma'am, I have got to give you something." And she said, "Then give it to whoever is behind you in this line that has not got it." And he turned around and looked at the line, and he did it. And that started something that went on in Harrow County for 30 years. Ambrose Teal came on the 10th of November, which was next to last. He came in his buggy in his black coat, and he did not get in the line, and he stood off to the side by the wagons for a good while, waiting for a break in it. And there was no break in it, and finally he understood that there was not going to be one. And he walked over and got at the end of the line behind a 14-year-old girl with a lard pail. He stood in that line for 2 hours and 40 minutes with his hat in both hands. When he got to the front, she was at the pan, and she did not stop skimming, because a pan does not stop for anybody, and that was not spite, it was a pan. He said, "Mrs. Renner?" She said, "Mrs. Teal." "How many gallons?" He said, "I have not come to buy syrup." He said, "I have come to bring you this," and he took the black hat out from under his arm, the one off the shelf between the horse liniment and the lamp chimneys, with 17 silver dollars in the bottom of it. He said, "You asked me for my word that it would be paid where it was bet, in front of the house, and I gave you my word before witnesses, and I mean to keep it. But there is not going to be any way to get that whole county into my store, so I have brought it out here, and I would take it as a kindness if you would let me say the rest of it out loud in front of these people." She looked at him for a moment. Then she handed the skimmer to Cora Sipe, which was the only time in 23 days that skimmer went into anybody else's hand, and she came around the end of the pan and stood in front of him and said, "Say it then." And Ambrose Teal turned around to a line of 30 of his own neighbors and customers and debtors standing in the cold with their jugs. And he said this. He said, "In January, in the back room of my store, 17 of us wrote a letter in Gideon Renner's name that he never saw, and we picked this woman's answer out of 3 because we thought her body would make the best joke, and we paid her fare across half a country to have it. And in May we put up $17 in my hat that she would not make 1 gallon of syrup, and I set that hat on my own shelf where every one of you could see it for 6 months, and I let it sit there, because it brought people into my store." He said, "She has made 812 gallons. I have got no cane, no corn, no molasses, and no credit at the bank, and my team is standing in my barn this minute eating her fodder. And I have got a store full of people who cannot pay me, and I cannot say one word to them about it, because I am the man who took $17 to bet against the only person in this county that raised a crop." Then he set the hat down on the flat rock where she had set the first jug, and he said, "That is the money. It is paid where it was bet, and I would like it counted so there is no question." And Saber Renner said, "Count it." Mrs. Sipe, Cora Sipe, counted 17 silver dollars out on that rock, one at a time in front of 30 people, and said, 17, and it was the only sound anybody made. Then Saber Renner did the thing that people in Harrow County were still telling their grandchildren about in 1930. She picked up the hat with the money back in it, and she handed it to Ambrose Teal, and she said, "No." She said, "Mr. Teal, I do not want your dollar, and I do not want any man's dollar that is in there, and I will tell you what I do want, and if you will not do it, then you may keep the money, and we will be square anyhow." She said, "Come the 1st of April, I am going to want 17 men to plant cane, not a patch in the corner, 10 acres apiece, on their best bottom ground, out of my seed, and I will sell them the seed at what it cost me to thresh it, and I will show every one of them how it is planted, and when it is cut, and how a mill is set, and I will run their cane on my mill for a 10th. And in October there will not be one family on this creek without syrup, and there will not be one team in this valley that goes into the winter on nothing, and this county will have a thing to sell that does not care whether it rains." She said, "That is what I want." "There is your hat." Ambrose Teal stood there holding his own hat full of his own money, with about 30 of his neighbors looking at him. And he said, "Ma'am, I will plant 20. There is one more thing about those 23 days that has to be told, and it is the part that everybody in that valley remembered longest. Longer than the fire, and longer than the sweep, and longer than the hat. And it did not happen at the mill at all. It happened at her table. From the first day of the run, Saber Renner fed everybody who came. Not the ones who worked. Everybody. It was a rule she made without ever announcing it, and it was so plainly a rule by the end of the first week that people came up that road at noon on purpose. And by the second week there were 2 planks laid across sawhorses out under the lean to roof with a bench on either side, because the house would not hold them. She got up at 3:30 every morning of that run, and she made bread before she fired the arch. There was a Dutch oven and a sheet iron cook stove, and a great blackened cast iron griddle her father had used, and out of those 3 things, and 11 weeks of no rain, and a county with nothing in it, that woman put a hot meal on 2 planks under a lean to roof for anywhere between 6 and 30 people every single day for 23 days, in between skimming a pan that could not be left and walking a sweep that could not be walked by anybody else. What she fed them was this: biscuits in the morning out of the Dutch oven, 4 dozen at a time, and a crock of butter when the cow was giving, and a bowl of pork drippings when she was not, and hot sorghum straight off the pan poured over the split biscuit in a slow dark ribbon so that it soaked down into the crumb and came out the bottom onto the tin plate. And the men would sop the plate with the last piece, and not one of them ever left anything. Cornbread at noon, baked in the griddle in rounds and cut in wedges, with a jug of syrup standing in the middle of the plank so a man could pour his own, and hot coffee with sorghum stirred into it instead of sugar, which is a taste a person either loves for life or does not. And in Harrow County that fall every man alive learned to love it. Sorghum gingerbread, which is a dark, wet, heavy, spicy thing that keeps for a week and travels in a saddlebag, and is very likely the best use anybody has ever found for a cup of syrup, and she baked it in the evenings when the pan was between runs and gave it away in squares wrapped in a cloth to whoever was going home in the cold. Boiled beans with a long pour of sorghum and a piece of salt pork, in a pot that was never once empty and never once washed out during the whole of that run, only added to. Dried apples stewed with syrup until the pot smelled like October, out of a sack of apples she had traded 4 gallons for. And on the last night of the run, the 12th of November, when the last of the cut cane had gone through the rollers and the last of the juice had walked itself down that pan, she took a bucket of the thickest syrup off the hot end and pulled taffy on the porch with it, and there were 9 grown men standing in the cold in the lamplight pulling sorghum candy between their hands until it went from black to bronze to a pale golden rope, laughing like boys. And one of them was Rufe Dennard with his hips strapped up, and one of them was the young Wexler who had called out about the price of lard, and all 9 of them had been standing on that depot platform in March. She fed the whole valley that fall. That is not a figure of speech, and it ought not to be softened into one. Between the syrup that went out in jugs and the meals that went across those 2 planks, there was not one family on the Muddy Fork from the head of the valley down to Tallow Springs that did not eat something that fall, that came off of 12 acres of sand ground and a heavy woman's hands. And here's the thing about that. The thing that a person 100 years later can miss entirely. They had laughed at her because she was fat. That was the whole of the joke, from the letter in January to the platform in March to the hat on the shelf in May. It was never about the cane, and it was never about Tennessee. 17 men had looked at a woman's plain, honest sentence about her own body, written down in her own hand so that nobody would be surprised, and had decided that a body like that was a funny thing to have shipped out to a valley for a laugh. And then that same body had built a stone arch in the heat of August, and had turned a mill that 4 other people could not turn, and had lifted an oak sweep pole off a man who had bet $1 against her, and had stood at a hot pan for 23 days without a full night's sleep, and had gotten up at 3:30 in the morning to make bread for the sons of the men who had laughed. Nobody in that valley ever put it together in a speech. Country people do not. But every one of them understood it in the way that matters, which is that they stopped seeing a fat woman and started seeing the woman who was feeding them. And after a while, a good many of them could not remember having ever seen anything else, which is a kind of forgetting that a person has to earn. The harvest supper was on the last Thursday in November at the schoolhouse in Tallow Springs, and it had not been held for 2 years because there had been nothing to hold it with. It was Ivy Teal who started it, and Cora Sipey who organized it, and the whole valley that carried it out, and it was, by any measure of the eating, a poor supper. There was no beef. There was almost no butter. There was no white sugar in that building at all. There were beans and cornbread and dried apple pie and a great many boiled potatoes and 2 hams that Elias Bowe had been saving. And there was, running down the middle of every table in that schoolhouse, one after another, all the way down, a jug of light amber sorghum syrup out of the Renner place. They put her at the head of the middle table. She did not want it. She said the head of the table ought to go to whoever had cooked the most of it. And Ivy Teal said, "Ma'am, sit down." And she sat down. And when the preacher had said grace, and everybody had started, Roof Dennard got up at the far end with his hips strapped and his hands on the table, and said he had something to say. And the room went quiet. He said, "I am the one that started the hat." He said, "I want it known in this room in front of everybody that in May I put down the first $1 and said this woman would not make 1 gallon. And 16 men followed me, and I have thought a good deal about it since a certain afternoon in October, and I have come to this. She was right, and every one of us was wrong, and not just wrong about the cane. We were wrong from the first letter." He said, "And if any man in this county ever tells that joke again where I can hear it, he had better be quicker than I am, because I have got a bad hip now, and I will not be able to catch him afterward." There was a laugh at the end of that, and it was the right kind, and it went around that schoolhouse and let a good deal of air into a room that had been holding its breath since March. And nobody ever told that joke again. Not once, not in either saloon, not at the blacksmith's, not at the depot. There were men in Tallow Springs who lived another 40 years and went to their graves having never once let on to their own children that they had had any part in it, and there were others who told it on themselves every chance they got, the way Josiah Pike did. And Pike would always end it the same way, which was, "And I stood on that platform with the rest of them and laughed at her. And she fed my children all winter. And that is the size of what I am." Late in that supper, when the tables had been pushed back and the fiddle had started, Gideon Renner came and stood behind his wife's chair. He had not said 50 words all evening, which was about his usual, and he stood there with his hat in his hands, turning it around by the brim, and finally she looked up at him and said, "What is it?" He said, "Come outside a minute." They went out and stood on the schoolhouse steps in the cold with the fiddle going behind them and the whole valley's wagons drawn up in the dark and the sky over Kansas the way it gets on a clear night in November, and he did not say anything for a while, which she was used to by then. Then he reached inside his coat and took out a folded piece of newspaper worn soft at the creases and handed it to her. She opened it up by the light coming out of the schoolhouse window, and it was the marriage paper out of St. Louis from January, with the advertisement in it that 17 men had written in his name, and it was folded so that the advertisement was on the outside, and it had been carried in a pocket for 11 months. She said, "Where did you get this?" He said, "Out of the stove in Teal's back room the day after I found out about it. It did not catch." She said, "Why?" And Gideon Renner said, "Because it is the only piece of paper in this world that ever brought me anything, and I did not write it, and I have never been able to make myself throw it away." He said, "I want to say a thing, and I am not going to say it well." He said, "I stood on that platform in March, and every man in this county was waiting to see me refuse you. And what none of them knew, and what I have not said to you in 8 months because I did not know how to start it, is that I was not being decent that day. I have thought about it all fall, and I want it straight between us. I looked at you standing there with 200 people laughing at you and your chin up like that, and I did not think. That poor woman. I thought I would not be able to do that. And then I thought, I want to know her. He said, I did not write that letter. But there is not a word in it I would take back, and if I had known in January how to write it myself, I would have written it. And I would have written it to you. Saber Renner stood on the steps of a schoolhouse in Harrow County, Kansas, with a piece of newspaper in her hand, and she was not, by her own account, a woman who cried easily. And she had not cried on a depot platform in March with 200 people laughing, and she had not cried in a field of ashes in October with her sleeves burned off. She cried there. And that enormous man stood in front of her and put his hat back on his head and put both arms around her, and there were people watching out of the schoolhouse window, and the two of them did not care one bit. The winter of 1887 and 88 was a hard one on the plains, and it was a very hard one in Harrow County, and it would have been worse than hard without those 12 acres, and everybody knew it while it was happening, which is unusual. People generally only work out what saved them years later. That valley worked it out in January. There was a stretch of 11 days after the New Year when the thermometer at the depot did not come up above 0, and the wind came across that country out of the northwest without one thing in 9 miles to slow it down. The Prairie Southern was blocked west of the county seat for a week. Nothing came in. There was no coal. And men were burning cane pomace and twisted hay and cottonwood that hissed. And in every soddy and stone house and dugout on the Muddy Fork there was a jug or a crock or a coal oil can standing back from the wall where it would not freeze with sorghum in it. You cannot live on syrup. Nobody did. What syrup does in a winter like that one is keep a thing on the table that a person is glad to see. And it is astonishing what that is worth when there is nothing else. Cornmeal and beans and salt pork will keep a family alive and will make a family miserable. And cornmeal and beans and salt pork with hot syrup on the cornbread and syrup in the coffee and a square of dark gingerbread on Sunday will keep a family alive and keep them talking to each other. Every woman in that county knew exactly what it was worth. It is the men who wrote the county history 40 years later and left it out. 11 farms wintered their teams on the fodder heap off that field. She sold it at the cost of hauling and no more, and when Elias Bowe came up in December with his last $4 in his hand for a load, she took 2 of the dollars and told him to bring the other 2 in April, and he brought them in April, and they came up the Muddy Fork Road all winter. That is the plain fact of it, and it is a strange thing to write down about a woman who had been laughed at on a public platform 9 months earlier by nearly every one of the same people. They came to her door in 1s and 2s all winter in weather that made a 9-mile trip a considered decision. And they did not all come to buy syrup either. That was the part that changed her life more than the money did. A young married woman came up in December with a colicky baby and no mother of her own alive in the state, and stayed 2 days. Cora Sipey's older boy came up in January to ask, red to the ears, what a man ought to do about a girl in Tallow Springs whose father did not like him. Ivy Teal drove out twice a month in the worst weather of the year, and the 2 of them sat at that packing crate table with coffee, and neither one of them ever said one word about what Ivy's husband had done, and neither one of them had to. The blacksmith came out and asked her to look at a bearing he was making for a wagon. 3 men came out on separate days about seed. And in the last week of February, the whole thing came to a head in the schoolhouse. It was Rufe Dennard who called the meeting, and Ambrose Teal who paid for the lamp oil, and there were 50-some men in that schoolhouse, and about 30 women standing along the back wall, and it was, in every way that mattered, the founding meeting of what became the Harrow County Cane Growers' Association, which is written down in the county history with a date and a list of officers, and no explanation whatsoever of how it came about. Here is how it came about. She stood up at the front of that schoolhouse in her brown calico with her hands folded in front of her, a very large woman in a room full of men who had bet against her 10 months before, and she talked for an hour and 40 minutes about sorghum cane, and not one person left. She told them what ground to put it on, which was their best bottom and not their worst corner, and she told them why. And she told them what it would cost them in corn ground, and did not pretend it was nothing. She told them to plant early amber and nothing else, and to keep it clean, and to rogue it by hand every July, and she told them exactly what to pull out, and she drew the off types on the schoolhouse blackboard with a piece of chalk. She told them cane wants planting later than corn, and thinner than they thought, and cultivating twice. She told them not to cut it before the seed went to dough, and not to leave it in the windrow more than 4 days, and not to strip it wet. She told them a mill has to be set with a knife blade at the first gap and a paper at the second, and she told them how to bed an arch level. And she told them that any man who tried to run a pan by the clock instead of by the skimmer would make sour syrup in the spring and scorched syrup in the fall, and would deserve both. Somebody asked her what happens if it turns wet instead of dry. She said, "Then you will make more of it, and you will have to be quicker with the skimmer. And your neighbors will have some too, and the price will come down, and you will still have a crop, and that is the whole point of it." She said, "Corn is a bet on rain. Cane is not a bet on anything." My father made syrup on Copper Creek for 30 falls, and he never had a year with none. Somebody asked her, from the back, and it was not asked meanly, what a woman was doing knowing all this. And Saber Renner said, "My father taught me. I stood at his pan from the time I was 9 years old, and I ran it myself for the last 6 years of his life after his hands failed, and I have made syrup every October since before some of you boys were born, and that is what was in that trunk on the platform in March, and any one of you could have found it out at any time this year by asking me." The room was very quiet after that. Then Ambrose Teal stood up in the middle of it, in front of every customer he had, and said, "I have got the only mill in this county that is not hers, and it is a poorer mill than hers, and I am done running it for a share. I will sell it to the association at what the iron is worth, and I move that Mrs. Renner be paid to set it and keep it, and that no man be allowed to touch the pan but her or whoever she says." It carried. There was one vote against, from a man who voted against everything on principle, and he planted 8 acres of cane that spring anyway. They planted, in Harrow County in the spring of 1888, 940 acres of sorghum cane. Off 1,100 pounds of seed that had come out of a tin box the size of a Bible, carried across half a continent under a woman's arm, because it was one of the 2 things in this world she would not sell. 17 men planted 10 acres apiece, and one of them planted 20, and she rode to every one of those fields at least twice before the 4th of July, on a broad gray mare Gideon bought for her in April, because the wagon was too slow for what she now had to do in a day. And it rained that summer. That is the joke that country plays. The summer of 1888 was a decent, ordinary, moderately wet Kansas summer, and the corn made a fair crop, and there were men that July who said, half to themselves, that the whole cane business had been a great deal of trouble over one dry year. Then October came, and Harrow County made better than 11,000 gallons of sorghum syrup, and the syrup buyers came out from the county seat and from 2 states, and it went east in barrels on the Prairie Southern out of a depot where 2 years before the whole town had turned out to laugh at a fat woman coming down off a train, and the money that came back into that valley for it. In a year when corn was worth about as much as the sack it was hauled in, was more cash money than Harrow County had seen in one fall since it was organized. That was when they stopped calling it her notion. The Renner Works went up on the flat above the spring in the spring of 1889, and she drew it herself on the back of the same seed catalog she had drawn the bearing block on. It was a shed 60 feet long open on the south side with a shingle roof, and under it stood 2 mills, the old $11 one she had rebuilt with a file and a blacksmith's shoulder, and a new heavy one out of Ohio with steel rollers that a horse could turn all day, and a stone arch 40 feet long with 2 pans on it, and a settling shed with 6 barrels and a cooling trough, and a rack for 160 jugs. It cost $1,100, and she paid cash for all of it but $300, and she had that $300 paid before Christmas. She bought Ambrose Teal's rollers off the association at the iron price, exactly as he had moved that they should be bought, and she set them under her own roof. And Ambrose Teal spent 9 falls of the rest of his life feeding cane into them for wages during the run, standing in the smoke in his shirt sleeves with his black coat hung on a nail. And he was, by everybody's account, including his own, a first-rate feed hand and a poor judge of a pan, and he never in 9 years asked to be let near the skimmer. Cora Sipp ran the settling shed. The Sipey boys ran the mills. Josiah Pike hauled. And the woman who had come off that train with a carpetbag, a flat trunk, $1.60 by the end of that first summer, and a copper skimmer wrapped in a flour sack, stood at the hot end of the number 1 pan in a heavy apron from the middle of September to the first week of December every year for 26 years. They put a label on the jugs starting in 1890. It was printed at the county seat on cream paper, and it had no picture on it and no fancy lettering. It said, "Renner Brothers" is what a man at the printer's office suggested, and she said no. And what it said when it was printed was Renner, Harrow County, Kansas, pure sorghum, and underneath that, in the same size letters, made by Sabra Renner. She was asked about that once by a buyer from Kansas City who thought it was an odd thing to put on a label. She said, "In this county there was a while when nobody could remember what my name was, and everybody could remember what I weighed. I have got no objection to my name being on a jug." The buyer bought 400 gallons. By 1894 there were 3,000 acres of cane in Harrow County and 2 other works besides hers, and a sorghum association with a secretary and a set of books, and a county paper ran a page about it every October. And Kansas as a whole was making better sorghum than it had ever made, because half a dozen counties had found out the same thing in the same decade. And none of that was hers alone, and she never once claimed it was. But there was a dry year in 1894, a bad one, and there was another in 1901, and in both of those years Harrow County had a crop when 3 counties around it had nothing. And in both of those years the elevator at Tallow Springs stayed open, and the bank at the county seat did not call the notes on the Muddy Fork. And there was not a farmer in that valley who did not know exactly why, and could not have told you the whole of it starting with a woman getting off a train in March of 1887. That is what she gave them, when it is all boiled down, not 812 gallons. A second crop. A thing to plant that did not care whether it rained. The other things happened the way other things happen. Their daughter was born in June of 1889 in the stone and sod house with Cora Sipp and Ivy Teal in the room and Gideon Renner outside splitting wood he did not need for 4 hours because there was nothing else he could do with himself. They named her Ephie after Sabra's father, and she grew up standing on an upended nail keg at the hot end of a pan with a skimmer in her hands, which is exactly how it is supposed to go. The house got built onto twice and then replaced in 1896 with a white frame house of 8 rooms that had a wide porch on the south side and a kitchen big enough to feed the crew in out of the weather, and every board of it was paid for with syrup. The old stone and sod house stayed standing behind it and was used for a milk house and was still there in the 1920s. Gideon Renner ran cattle and freighted and cut and hauled the wood for the works for 26 years, and was, in the way that county reckoned such things, a prosperous man, and he never once in his life corrected anybody who said the money came off his wife's cane. Because it did. He was on the school board. He did not talk any more than he ever had. When he was an old man of 60, he was still the biggest man in any room he walked into, and there were young fellows at the livery in 1912 who had never heard the story and thought the mountain man in the fur-collared coat must be the one who built all that up. The ones who had been on the platform in March never let those young fellows keep thinking it very long. Rufe Dennard planted cane for the rest of his life and served 2 terms as the association's president, and he had a habit at the annual meeting every year of getting up and telling the whole thing on himself. The letter and the hat and the sweep pole and the wagon that fell on him, and it got to be expected, and if he ever tried to sit down without telling it, somebody would call out for it. He was buried in the Tallow Springs Cemetery in 1911, and it was Sabra Renner who sat with his wife the last 3 nights. Ambrose Teal sold the store in 1899 and moved to Wichita, and there is a letter of his in the county museum written in 1904 to his son that has one line in it that people copy out. He wrote, "There was a woman came into this county on a train that I had paid the fare for as a joke on account of her size, and inside of 1 year she was feeding every family on the Muddy Fork. And I have thought about that nearly every week of my life since, and I have never been able to decide whether it says more about her or about me." Josiah Pike's youngest, the one who cried over a piece of gingerbread when he was 5 years old, farmed on the Muddy Fork until 1941 and was interviewed for the county's 75th anniversary book, and he said this, and it is printed in there, and it is very likely the truest sentence in the whole volume. He said, "We thought she was a joke because she was fat. And then the rain quit, and it turned out she was the only person in this county that had ever learned how to make something out of a year like that." He said, "I have been ashamed of my father and this whole town my entire life over that, and I have never once been ashamed of eating her syrup, because she never made us feel like we were taking it." And she showed them. That is the part that ought not to get lost in the fondness of it, because it was not fondness that turned that valley around. She did not win Harrow County over by being sweeter than they deserved, although she was. She won it because on the 21st of October, 1887, at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, in front of 6 men on horseback and 4 people who worked for her, a woman that every soul in that county had reduced to a number on a freight scale put both hands on an oak pole that nobody else present could move, and leaned, and the iron came off the bind, and the juice ran down the spout. Nobody in that county ever had a way to laugh at that. There is no joke that fits it. They tried for about a week, and then even the trying stopped. The $17 never went back into anybody's pocket. Ambrose Teal carried that hat home from the end of the rows on the 10th of November with the money still in it, exactly as she had handed it back to him, and he did not know what on earth to do with it, and it sat in his back room until the schoolhouse meeting in February. Then he brought it to the meeting and set it on the teacher's desk and said that $17 was about what it would cost to freight the association's first seed and scales out from the county seat, and that he could not think of a better end for it. And it was voted through without discussion, because nobody in that room wanted to talk about that hat any longer than they had to. So the seed cane that went into 940 acres in the spring of 1888 was hauled out on money that 17 men had put up to bet that a heavy woman could not make 1 gallon of syrup. She thought that was funny. She was the only one who ever thought it was funny, and she said so at the association supper in 1905 and got the first laugh out of that subject in 18 years, and the room was glad of it, the way a family is glad when somebody finally says out loud the thing everybody has been walking around. The hat itself ended up in the Harrow County Museum, which is 2 rooms in the old bank building at Tallow Springs, and it is there now in a case by the window with a card under it that gives the date and the names of the 17 men, all 17, because she insisted on that when the case was made up in 1922, and there was some feeling in the county that the names ought to be left off. She said, "No, put them on." Every one of those men lived long enough to be sorry, and most of them said so out loud in front of people, and that is worth a good deal more than being left off a card. In the same case, on the same shelf, there is a copper skimmer, hammered thin and dished and punched with holes on an ash handle 4 feet long that is worn down in one place to the shape of a hand. It hung over the kitchen door of the white frame house for the last 9 years of her life after her shoulder gave out and Ephie took the pan. There is one more thing that belongs in this story, and then it is done. In September of 1906, the Prairie Southern put up a new depot at Tallow Springs, brick, with a proper freight room, because by then that town was shipping better than 9,000 barrels of syrup a year out of it, and the old plank building was a joke. There was a day made of it, with a band from the county seat and speeches, and the association asked Saber Renner to say something, and she said she would. She was 48 years old that fall. She had never lost a pound in her life, and had never in her life set out to. She came down to that depot in a good black dress, with a white collar, in a spring wagon with her husband and her daughter, and she stood up on the boards of the new platform in front of about 400 people, a great many of whom had been standing on the old boards 19 years before. And the crowd went quiet the way a crowd does when it already knows what it is going to hear and has been looking forward to it. She said, "Thank you." She said, "I got off a train on this spot in March of 1887, and there were more people here than there are today, and they had not come for the mail." There was a noise from that crowd that was half a laugh and half something else. She said, "I am not going to tell that story, because Mr. Dennard has been telling it for 20 years, and he tells it better than I do, and he has got the hip to prove it." Then she said, "I will tell you the only part of it that is any use to anybody." She said, "When I came out here, I had one thing that this county needed and did not know it needed, and it was not in my trunk, and it was not in my tin box. It was that my father stood me up on a nail keg at his pan when I was 9 years old and taught me a trade with his own hands, and he never once said to me that a girl could not learn it. And he never once said to me that I was too big to be any use, and because of him, I came into the hardest year this valley ever had, knowing how to do a thing that nobody here knew how to do." She said, "There is not a family in this county now that does not have a cane patch and a jug in the cellar, and I am glad of it, and I have made a good living out of it, and I am glad of that too. But if you want to know what I would have you take home from a day like this, it is not the syrup." She said, "It is that there was a woman standing on this platform in 1887 that this whole town had decided about before she ever opened her mouth, and every one of you was wrong, and you were not wrong about the cane. You were wrong about what you were looking at." She said, "So when the next one gets off that train, and there will always be a next one, be quicker than we were." And then she sat down, and the band played, and the 17 men who were still living, 11 of them by that fall, stood up along the front of that crowd, which had been arranged beforehand by Ruth Dennard, and which she did not know about until it happened, and took their hats off, all 11 at once, and stood there holding them until she made them quit. Saber Renner made sorghum syrup in Harrow County, Kansas, for 38 falls. She died in the White House above the spring in the March of 1931, at 72 days after her husband, and the two of them are in the Tallow Springs Cemetery under one stone. And the county closed the bank, and both stores for the funeral and the schoolhouse could not hold the people. The stone says her name and the dates, and one line under it that Ephie chose. And there is no scripture on it, and nothing about a beloved wife or mother, though she was both. It says, "She fed this valley." There is a photograph of her in the case in that museum, taken at the works in about 1900, and it is worth describing because it is the only one anybody ever took of her working. She is standing at the hot end of the #1 pan in a heavy apron with her sleeves rolled past the elbow and the skimmer up in her right hand, turned sideways in the light, watching the syrup come off the edge of it. There is steam across the whole top of the picture. There are 3 men in the background at the mill, and you cannot make out their faces. She is a very large woman, and the photograph does not hide it, and her chin is level, exactly the way it was on a plank platform in the cold in March of 1887 with 200 people laughing at her, and she is not looking at the camera at all. She is looking at the flake.